It's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we instantly improve the lives of families of critically ill patients in intensive care, so that you can have peace of mind, real power, real control, and so that you can influence decision making fast, even if you're not a doctor or a nurse in intensive care. In last week's blog, I've shown you the 5 questions you need to ask if the intensive care team wants you to donate your loved one's organs in an end-of-life situation. You can check out last week's blog if you're clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to show you the 3 distinct reasons the intensive care team doesn't want you to question their approach or have peace of mind, control, power, and influence. You know by now that you've got a problem. You know by now that if your critically ill loved one is in intensive care with a critical illness and is either very unstable and in a very critical condition, or is in a life-threatening situation, or is in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or is having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or is even approaching their end of life in intensive care. You know that you have a serious issue at hand, and you know that peace of mind, control, power, and influence in such situations are very hard to come by. In fact, 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence during this once-in-a-lifetime situation when their loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Those families of critically ill patients in intensive care tend to be so stressed, overwhelmed, challenged, frustrated, paralyzed by fear, vulnerable, and out of their comfort zone that they are literally running around like headless chickens, so to speak. And even worse, their poor body language implicitly or explicitly is telling everyone around them, including the intensive care team, that they have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. Those families of critically ill patients in intensive care don't even know that peace of mind, control, power, and influence is something they can achieve if you know what to do, if you know what questions you need to ask, and if you know how to position yourself and your critically ill loved one during this challenging and once-in-a-lifetime situation. And you might say, Patrick, I have no idea how to position myself. I have no idea where to start, and I have no idea how I can get peace of mind, control, power, and influence. And the reality and the fact of the matter is that it's totally possible to get there so that you can turn things around in your favor. Even though the intensive care team doesn't want you to have peace of mind, control, power, and influence. That's the last thing they want to have happen, and having said that, the intensive care team is so used to be running the show, to drive the bus, so to speak, and they tend to be so busy in driving their mainly hidden agenda whilst you are busy worrying and fearing for the very life and the very well-being of your critically ill loved one. As a matter of fact, if I have learned one thing in more than 15 years intensive care nursing in 3 different countries, where I literally worked with thousands of critically ill patients and their families, it's that if a family had peace of mind, control, power, and influence, the intensive care team didn't like it. The intensive care team doesn't want families of critically ill patients to have peace of mind, control, power, and influence, because the intensive care team then perceives you and your family as difficult or demanding. And that's good news. If the intensive care team perceives you and your family as difficult or demanding, you are well on the right track. The other 99% of families of critically ill patients in intensive care who have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence are busy sucking up to the intensive care team and putting them on a pedestal. The result, as I've just mentioned, no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. However, the truth of the matter is that once you and your family are on the right path to peace of mind, control, power, and influence, especially if your loved one is in one of those challenging, difficult, demanding, and once-in-a-lifetime situations where they're very unstable and in a very critical condition, or in a life-threatening situation, or in intensive care for long-term treatments and long-term stays, or where they are having a severe or traumatic head or brain injury, or where they are approaching the end of life in intensive care. That's exactly where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, because from the intensive care team's perspective, there is far more at stake during those difficult, challenging, demanding, and often heartbreaking situations than just the life or the well-being of your critically ill loved one. And that's exactly why the intensive care team doesn't want you to have peace of mind, control, power, and influence. Once you and your family understand what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care, once you and your family understand the politics, the dynamics, the power play, the intrigue, the psychology, and most of all the hidden agendas in intensive care, that's when you will have peace of mind, control, power, and influence. Once you and your family know and understand that what's happening behind the scenes in intensive care impacts on the positioning of your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis by the intensive care team, and once you understand that what's happening behind the scenes can impact on the care and treatment offered or not offered for your critically ill loved one, that's when you will have peace of mind, control, power, and influence. In fact, there are 3 distinct reasons why the intensive care team doesn't want you to have peace of mind, control, power, and influence during those difficult, challenging, and heartbreaking situations. Let's get right into those 3 reasons. Number 1. The intensive care team's or unit's financial interests. Let's face it, intensive care is a multi-billion-dollar per year industry. If your critically ill loved one is in one of those difficult and challenging situations that could cost a lot of money with no guaranteed outcomes, the intensive care team will be doing the maths. The truth of the matter is that if the intensive care team perceives your loved one's treatment and stay in intensive care as too costly, or if they think that they're not making any money, the intensive care team's calculations will inevitably impact on the intensive care team's positioning of your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis, and also on the care and treatment offered or not offered to your critically ill loved one. Your job is to be aware that the intensive care team is counting the dollars, and if you can't read the signs or the writing on the wall, and if you don't question, you will have no peace of mind, no control, no power, and no influence. Number 2. Bed occupancy and other patients waiting for intensive care beds. This is another big one, and one that escapes families of critically ill patients as well. If your critically ill loved one is in a difficult, dire, challenging and heartbreaking situation, and the intensive care team knows that they have other patients waiting for scarce, precious and expensive intensive care beds, and the intensive care team also thinks that your loved one might block a bed for a long time to come in intensive care, the intensive care team once again may adjust your critically ill loved one's diagnosis and prognosis accordingly, and may also adjust the care and treatment for your critically ill loved one according to their priorities. Their priorities might change at any given time because they perceive other admissions to intensive care as quote-unquote more interesting, more financially viable, and therefore the minute the intensive care team suggests a withdrawal or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one, you always need to question their approach, because the very reason for this approach could be bed and financial pressures. ICU beds are in high demand, and often ICUs can't cope with this high demand on beds. Third reason, medical research interests. If I had $1 for every patient in intensive care who is enrolled in a medical research study without their knowledge, without them or their families being informed, and without giving their or their families consent, I would be a millionaire. The fact of the matter is that intensive care units heavily rely on funding from universities or even government organizations to conduct medical research on real human beings in intensive care. Therefore, the interests in intensive care, besides treating critical illness, are huge, and once again intensive care units rely heavily on 5, 6 or even $7-figure funding per year in order to do medical research on real human beings. The truth of the matter is that if your critically ill loved one doesn't fall into a research category and is very sick, the intensive care team might once again suggest a withdrawal or a limitation of treatment as being quote-unquote in the best interest of your critically ill loved one. Then you need to ask the intensive care team whether they are not trying hard enough, because they might have other competing interests. The same applies if your critically ill loved one is inevitably dying in intensive care, because the intensive care team might give you false hope for a recovery of your loved one, and they want to continue treatment until they finish performing their medical research, only to prolong your loved one's suffering unnecessarily, and you may find that the end of life of your loved one is all but dignified. The bottom line is that you and your family need to be on high alert, and you can't really afford not paying attention, and you can't really afford not having peace of mind, control, power and influence during this once-in-a-lifetime situation. So, how can you have peace of mind, control, power and influence whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care? You get to that all-important feeling of peace of mind, control, power and influence when you download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn quickly how to get peace of mind, real power and real control, and how you can influence decision making fast whilst your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. Your free Instant Impact Report gives you in-depth insight that you must know whilst your loved one is critically ill or is even dying in intensive care. Sign up and download your free Instant Impact Report now by entering your email below. In your free Instant Impact Report, you learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that the doctors and the nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. In your free report, you will also discover how to ask the doctors and the nurses the right questions, discover the many competing interests in intensive care, and how your critically ill loved one's treatment may depend on those competing interests. How to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle and vulnerability even if your loved one is dying. You get 5 killer tips and strategies helping you to get on the right path to peace of mind, control, power and influence in your situation. You will get real-world examples that you can easily adapt to your and your critically ill loved one's situation. How to stop being intimidated by the intensive care team and how you will be seen as equals. You'll get crucial behind the scenes insight so that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care, and how you need to manage doctors and nurses in intensive care, and it's not what you think. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog, and I'll see you again in another update next week. Make sure you also check out our Your Questions Answered section, where we answer your questions, or send me an email to support@intensivecarehotline.com with your questions. This is Patrick Hutzel from intensivecarehotline.com, and I'll see you again next week in another update.